Hello, hello, everyone. Adrian, I'm shocked.
I'm not wearing a shirt. I know. Apologies. I know. Well, I'm wearing a polo shirt. Does that not qualify?
The red tie. We're missing the red tie.
We're missing the red tie. We're missing the power dressing. Is our guest speaker, Rabbi Birnbaum, on the line? Can't see him. Nope. Well, I welcome everybody. Hopefully he will join. So I can't hear you, Rabbi Karlbach. You've gone mute. Maybe.
Hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah. Well, shall we kick off with the Tehillim anyway? In the meantime, and I'll just WhatsApp Dinah to check that there isn't a problem. If we could do that.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to say Tillim as we do every week. We'll say Tillim in honor for all those who are sick, and we definitely have in mind the recovery as well of our dear friends Chaim Yitzchak ben Bela and Rafael Chanan Shimon ben Bela. And let also say together Kapitel Kufchaf Aleph, Psalm 121. Shira Malis is the Einayil Ardi Ma'ayin Yavo Yazrim.
Shira Malis is El Haim Mania Boisri.
Ezrimi Madino Yoise Shemaim Viodet.
Matanas Shemaim Varetz.
Ayitan Lamraglacha, Yonum Shaimlecha.
Mitin Lamraglacha, Yonum Shaimarecha.
Vilayonum Vilayishon Shaimer Yisrael.
Yonum Vilayishon Shomer Israel.
Adonai Shaimlecha, Adonai Tzilcha, Al Yad Yaminecha.
Adonai Tzilcha, Al Yad Yaminecha.
Yoimim Hashem Eshlekeka V'yareach Baloila.
Shemesh Loikekech Belayla.
Adonai Yishmarcha Mikol Ra, Yishmar Es Nafshecha.
Yishmar Chemekora, Yishmar Et Nashecha.
Adonai Yishmar Tzeizcho V'yecha Miata V'yadoilam.
Yishmar Tzeizcho V'yecha Miata V'yadoilam.
Psalm Kuf Lamed, Psalm 130. Shira Malais Mimamakim Karasicha Adonai.
Shira Malais Mimamakim Karasicha Adonai.
Adonai Shima Vakeli Tiana Znecha Vakashuva Isakol Tachanunai.
Adonai Shima Vakeli Tiana Znecha Vakashuva Tachanunai.
Mavoy Nois Tishmer Ya Adonai Miyamoid.
Imavanot Tishmer Ya Adonai Miyamod.
Imcha Haslicha Laman Tivadei.
Slicha Laman Tivadei.
Bis Adonai Kivsa Nafshi V'lidvarei Hoicholti.
Adonai Kivita Nafshi V'lidvarei Hoicholti.
Nafshi Adonai Mishayim Nim Laboiker Shayim Nim Laboiker.
Nafshi Adonai Mishayim Laboiker Shayim Laboiker.
Yachir Yisrael El Adonai Kim Adonai HaChesed V'Harbe Imo Yiftus.
El Adonai Kim Adonai HaChesed V'Imo Yiftus.
Hu Yiftas Yisrael Mikol Avinoisav. Then a quick Mishabeach, and for anyone, when I come to the name, everyone can have in mind or say actually all those who are they know neither for Shalema, Mishabeach, I've seen Abraham, Yitzchak, Moshe, Aaron, David, Shlomi, who Yivarech es Chaim Yitzchak ben Bela, Chanan Shimon ben Bela. Babul Shinat Midnakum Saka Babur Mischazak Shbarach Yunam Lechem Aleim Achlim Achpoitz Marzikra Chzioisam Shalom Heda for Shlim Lachem and Ramach Evarehem Shasag Gidem and Furus enough which to go for Neymar. Amen. Adrian? Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Birnbaum. The man we've all been waiting for.
Thank you so much.
You'd like me to make you the host, so if you'd like to share your screen.
Yes, please, that'd be fantastic. Just my video's cut out for some reason. Just trying to fix that now. Just bear with me. Thank you. Interesting. Okay. Apparently no one's allowed to see me. Let's try this. There we are. Okay, looks like at least the default camera on the laptop is working. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ephraim. Thank you for your welcome. Have you guys done the Tehillim already?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me for this virtual lunch and learn. I'm sure this is a break from the norm, from the usual lunch and learn at Clifford Chance, which I don't think I've ever had the pleasure of hosting. I was asked by Dina to speak, not specifically about a Holocaust-related topic, but I thought in light of the fact that obviously tomorrow is the 27th, I know that time has lost all sense and meaning over the last year, but tomorrow is the International Holocaust Memorial Day. I thought it would be interesting to delve into for a bit a very complex, complicated halachic topic, which surrounds as we know, sadly, there were a number of highly unethical medical experiments performed by the Nazis throughout the Holocaust, primarily on Jewish prisoners, but of course there were peoples of other ethnicities. And questions arose after the war of the validity, of the permissibility, really, of using the data and findings that were extrapolated from those experiments to further medical and scientific knowledge and technology. And with that said, I think it's important to give a bit of an introduction. I am Birnbaum, Director of Education with ACE UK. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I know I got an email recently from someone called Jeremy Lebret, who pointed out that my bio doesn't say, and it should, apparently, that I'm a member of the Golders Green Beth Midrash, otherwise known as Monks. I'll put that right front and center on my bio in future. But in my capacity working with ACE UK, I sort of oversee our national educational program and really do encounter, thank God, a number of different audiences, different situations, different clientele, and it is a fantastic experience overall. I guess rules of engagement, important to make a note of. Please do feel free to interrupt at any time. There is some facility, if some of you may be familiar with this, to sort of virtually raise your hand using the Zoom function. I am going to be screen sharing, which means I probably won't see someone who has virtually raised their hand. So if you have any questions, I'll be asking lots of questions as we go through this. It's a very, very meaty topic, very difficult to grapple with. I would appreciate the collective legal brains of Clifford Chance and your input. So feel free at any point to speak up and interrupt. I really am, I hope, as laid back as they get. So without further ado, let's have a look into the parameters of where this came from. I'm just going to make sure I have it open. Yes.
Sorry, first of all, I was thrown out of the one of the vagaries of doing things remotely. I was thrown out the meeting by my internet went down, so I joined late. So and ordinarily I introduce the speakers, but so I do apologise on this occasion. But it's a bit I do keep freezing, so just to let you know. Anyway.
That's totally fine, Adrian. Thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction as well. It's great to see you. I had similar I've actually had to come to the office because my Wi-Fi at home just was not cooperating since the snow. It hasn't been cooperating.
Wrong kind of
Yeah, there's some
yeah.
the drawbacks of nice, fun weather. Let's have a look at the background of this story. I'm going to make sure I'm sharing. There it is. I often share the wrong screen, and then people get a glimpse of my kids' schoolwork, which is fascinating, but not what we're talking about this afternoon. Let's have a look. Okay, let's go all the way up, all the way back to the beginning. A very good place to start, as they say. So, hypothermia experiments at Dachau, one of the concentration and death camps. The question is benefiting from unethically obtained research. Now, the background to this story is this research took place in approximately 1941 to 1942. And the historical context was, and I'm going to be speaking everything, this is because I've realized over the last months or so that it's not quite enough in our Zoom era to speak out a point, because often people have problems with audio or volume, or they can't actually have the volume up for whatever reason. So it's often helpful to have what I'm saying in front of you, so you can read it as we go along. So in the wake of the Battle of Britain and Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion on the Eastern Front into Russia, it became very clear to the Nazi high command that they were woefully lacking, in a sense, of A, preparation, and B, mitigation of how to prevent casualties and catastrophes with their soldiers dying of hypothermia from either falling into the North Sea or the Channel, and then over in Russia from obviously being exposed to, as they said, General Winter, the Russian general who ultimately won the war, principally at Stalingrad. So they wanted research done that would look into developing solutions to the problem of how to mitigate the effects of hypothermia and extreme weather conditions. Now, obviously and sadly, Nazi high command had at its disposal pretty much an unlimited supply of human guinea pigs. Forgive me for using that term. We're going to get back to it very shortly and why it's significant. And so they turned to the commandants of the concentration camp of Dachau, and they said, we want you to run a series of experiments that will demonstrate what we need to implement to change the effects or to mitigate the effects of hypothermia and to improve the chances of our soldiers on the field surviving extreme weather conditions and extreme circumstances. To this end, they appointed Professor Ernst Holzenhörner, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, and Dr. Sigmund Rasche, by I'm sure no coincidence, his surname in Hebrew means evildoer, Rasha. Sigmund Rasche, who is shown on the right of the picture. You can see one of the prisoners wearing a life jacket, which would have been the uniform of the German Navy or the Luftwaffe as well, immersed in a tank of freezing cold water. They conducted some 360 experiments on prisoners at the concentration camp, and well over 100 of them perished. Dozens more suffered irreparable injury as a result of these experiments. And the basic point was, or the basic thrust of the experiments, and forgive the grainy quality of the images, obviously they're very, very old pictures, they would dress the prisoners up, as you can see, in regular standard Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe uniforms, and then would submerge them in vats of freezing cold water for as long as 5 hours at a time. There were other experiments going on in the courtyard and the grounds around the concentration camp, particularly in the winter, where they would force, similarly dressed in uniform, they would lead these prisoners out, make them stand in the snow to simulate a German army on the Eastern Front locked in a stalemate with Stalin's armies, and thereby test what sort of uniforms or equipment do we need to give our soldiers to preserve their lives in the event that they are cut off from their unit, in the event that they have to crash land into the Channel or the North Sea. How do we improve the chances of their survival? Sigmund Rasche, who had his own background is a bit of a shady one. It's not clear historically how he became so personally close to the Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler. I should add Yimach Shemo v'Zichro to that one. Rumor has it that because he had married a woman who was 15 years older than him, and this woman was at one point Himmler's mistress, that allowed Russia, as it were, access to the absolute Nazi high command, and he was seen very favorably. He was feared. Despite being quite young, people trembled, they say. Whenever he walked into a room, the room fell silent. People were petrified He would report their goings on back to Himmler himself. The bottom line is, though, when it comes to his medical credentials as a practitioner, Russia was woefully lacking, and most of the experiments conducted in Dachau were not conducted with any real empirical evidence or data. They did not follow scientific protocol, even of that which existed at the time. And there's a question of the reliability of the data they extrapolated from these experiments. As you can see there from the slide here, horrific details, because or really one of the main factors to consider in treating hypothermia is how to reverse its effects. How to reverse its effects without worsening the condition of the patient. I'm just a rabbi, I'm not a doctor, although as my grandmother of blessed memory told me, I spent enough time in yeshiva that I could have become a doctor instead, but in the end decided not to. But the barest knowledge I have of medicine, as far as I've read, is that if you warm up a victim of hypothermia too quickly, the result can be fatal. And so the Nazis, as a second part of these experiments, having submerged these prisoners in these freezing cold vats of water, would then drag them out and reheat them, as it were, warm them up in different methods. And the most painful and brutal was they would take them from a vat of freezing cold water and literally throw them into a vat of boiling hot water, literally just to see what would happen, out of pure, perverse, scientific, evil curiosity. So that's the background to it. Now, it didn't stop in 1945. By 1984, more than 45, this is peer-reviewed publications, had drawn and made reference to the experiments at Dachau in the conversations surrounding hypothermia. Someone called Dr. Robert Pozos, who was the director of hypothermia at the research laboratory in Minnesota, he was the chief campaigner, as it were, to make this data and this research public. He saw absolutely no ethical or moral quandary. He saw no problem with public, obviously in his role as a director of the hypothermia research laboratory, he saw great value and great utility in publishing the findings of these horrendous experiments. And in 1988, he said, look, it's already been used as a reference point in so many peer-reviewed publications. It's high time we actually allow the data itself to see the light of day. His request was blocked in a medical and scientific review in the United States. But the fact that he'd made a request prompted another doctor, Jewish doctor called Dr. Robert Berger, who I believe was a descendant of Holocaust survivors. He published a scathing critique of Pozos in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1990, just 2 years later. And he sort of launched a double-bladed sword as an attack, a two-pronged attack on this request in 1988. His first attack was, it's unreliable. As we said, Sigmund Rascher was given the position in Dachau simply by way of a result of his personal closeness to Heinrich Himmler. He himself was woefully underqualified to conduct such complicated and complex experiments, and you cannot possibly rely on the data used. That was his main thrust, but Berger also said, and one of the, and I told you earlier, I'd mentioned this again, I'm going to turn this over to the floor. We spoke about human guinea pigs. One of the most powerful lines, you could Google it, you could look it up, it's the England Journal of Medicine, 1990, Robert Berger, Dachau or hypothermia experiments. Google should deliver the results instantly, as they say. But one of the most powerful lines in Berger's critique was he said that even if we were to be confronted with a reliable set of data, as in even if Dr. Sigmund Rascher and his team were qualified and relied on empirical evidence, and the data and research they provided is reliable, he says, nonetheless, we cannot use it because by using it, he says, and I quote, the victims retrospectively become our human guinea pigs and we their torturers. I read this, it was a very moving, very powerful line. And he therefore says it's ethically unsustainable, impossible for a person with, self-esteem, a self-respecting individual to even seek any means of benefit from data or research that's been obtained through such horrendously unethical means. That, however, wasn't the end. You would have thought that would have, sort of buried the hatchet. That's the end, never to see the light of day again. Unfortunately, and this, I only noticed this when I was doing a bit more research into this topic, in 2004, which is quite recent, Dr. David Bogod, which I don't know if he's Jewish. There is a Jewish surname Bagad, which is popular in Israel. I don't think he is. consultant anaesthetist at the Notts University NHS Trust. He attended a lecture in 2004. He's one of the most senior in his position in this country, and he attended a lecture in 2004. And as the lecturer was going through slide by slide discussing the effects and how to mitigate them in terms of hypothermia, he was struck by a slide that looked pretty much exactly like the one you've just seen, one of these pictures. And the lecturer who was presenting, the presenting professor, started discussing the findings at Dachau. And he said, and I quote, "I was taken aback by this unexpected and unwelcome intrusion into an otherwise erudite presentation. I was even more surprised by the reaction of the audience to these slides. There was none. Quite shockingly, there was none. At the time, I put this down to a natural and creditable reluctance to offend the keynote speaker, but this optimistic view was dashed by the very next slide, which showed a photograph of a pig immersed in water, an experiment carried out after the war in order to confirm the Dachau data. This slide, unlike the first one, was greeted by an audible sharp intake of breath from the audience." So Dr. Vogel was absolutely dumbfounded and shocked that as recently as 2004, Dachau was still being mentioned. And the research and experimentation was still being drawn upon for scientific and medical evidence. And what shocked him more than anything was the fact that the audience he was sitting among, their reaction to a pig in a vat of cold water was far more horrified than their reaction to human beings, innocent prisoners in exactly the same situation. And as a result of this, he penned another scathing editorial, which again you can find, I think he did it through the Nottingham NHS Trust, where he wrote of his disgust and how he deplored the fact that we've been so desensitized over the years, and with all the references and all the mentions, he basically said enough is enough, this has to stop here. That takes us pretty much to the modern era. And here's the question, I'm going to hand this over to the floor. What do you think is the halachic perspective? Here's an example of some of the data showing, as you can see on the left, the y-axis, the temperature of the water, and then the x-axis is the time it took until the victim perished. And then the recovery time at the end. What do you think? I'll turn this over. Anyone feel free to speak up. Where does Judaism, where does Jewish law stand on this question? Using data or research for medical and scientific benefit, but derived from horrendously unethical sources. Where do we sit?
Can I maybe just offer a couple of observations, if I may?
Sure.
So I think the point that you've already alluded to around the efficacy of the science is clearly important. So if the data set is nonsensical, then I think we would say there's no value in using it, referring to it, or anything. Let's just proceed on the hypothesis that there is value in the data gathered. I think the only example that sort of springs to mind, although I appreciate it's a bit of a stretch, is kilayim, right? So the Torah forbids one to sow fruits and other agricultural products that are different. But if that has happened for whatever reason, albeit in breach of halakhic principles, one is able to benefit from that. And so, admittedly, there's something of a stretch, but I would argue similarly here, especially if we are saying that the data set in question would be beneficial to human survival and improving health. Again, pikuach nefesh, pretty much trumps everything else. So I would say those are two bases that I would argue for using the science. And I appreciate the moral difficulties, but I think I would see that as the correct halachic answer.
Mark, thank you very, very much. And there's certainly an awful lot of validity to what you say. I will mention that there are two wildly diverging paths we can take with this discussion. Mark has mentioned a realm that's called Isurei Hana'ah, which means certain items, and there is no one-size-fits-all uniform reason behind this. There are certain items or occurrences that Torah law mandates is asur b'hana'ah, which means forbidden to benefit from. We certainly don't have the time, and I certainly don't have the scholarship at all, or the rabbinic academics to go into that subject. But we're definitely going to bear it in mind. I think Mark your argument falls into place almost like a Benthamite. It's utilitarian. The utility at the end of the day, once something unethical has happened, if benefit can be drawn from that, the utility of that benefit says, obviously, not swallow your pride, but don't listen to the voice of emotion for a moment and go ahead and use it. We're going to come back to that definitely moving on. Let's focus on some more. Anyone else got ideas pro or against using this data? Thank you, Mark, for that, by the way.
Rabbi, so I think the principle mitzvah baba, I think it is. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a principle around mitzvah baba to do with objects that were used for an avera, which then you use for a mitzvah, and whether you need to use that object to do the mitzvah, whether you needed to do the avera to produce that mitzvah as well. So in general, I think if you have an object that was used for an avera, then it's good to use it for a mitzvah, as long as there isn't a connection between those two acts. So that would be an object rather than information, but that might apply here.
Avi, thank you very much. It is incidentally, Avi, you've mentioned an object. Incidentally, there is a much broader discussion. Again, we don't have time for it, of whether what's called in halacha histaklut, which means simply reading something or looking at something, is that called benefiting? Is that called something that is derived from a forbidden action? As in, it's very different. For example, just top of my head example, eating food that isn't kosher. That's a clear and obvious physical benefit. Reading data or research, or reading a book, for example, just looking at something, is that called benefit? The opinion of the Shulchan Aruch seems to be that it is called benefit, but there are many diverging opinions on that question. But Avi, thank you very much. I hope to come back to that point as well as we move forward. So there's seems to be an argument, two arguments for, slightly against. Any strong arguments against using this research or data? Okay, I think that's Zoom etiquette. That's a long enough pause. I'm not sure what the Zoom etiquette is at Clifford Chance. I think that there are, it's the problem we perhaps have is that when looked at from an ethical perspective, the arguments against using this data or research, they're pretty obvious, as in they're quite easy to identify. And we're going to go into one particular one. I think the most obvious is a question, and again, I'm interested to hear where people sit on this. By using that data and research, what does that do to our relationship with the victims? We're going to look at the perpetrators in just a moment, but I go back to that quote from Dr. Berger, who again published that scathing critique in 1990, when he said, if we use this retrospectively, they become our guinea pigs and we become their torturers. Do you agree with that? Or is there perhaps a totally wildly different approach to look at our relationship with the victims if we go ahead and use this data?
If I could go again, then I would say perhaps we're honouring their memories. That if we could talk to them, they might say, don't let my death be in vain. You didn't kill me, at least you can get something out of this terrible thing that happened.
Thank you, Avi. I think it's again a fantastic point, and this is it's far be it from us to even dip our toes into such a discussion, but I guess it's necessary for the purposes of this conversation. It is a question, as my bio does say. I'm a massive fan of Elie Wiesel, and not just the person, but the author. I've read his books extensively, and one of his most moving pieces, which he writes about everywhere, but consolidates in Legends of Our Time. He writes that what infuriates him more than anything is the living talking about the dead, as in passing comment or passing judgment, as it were. And Avi, this is not a criticism of what you've said. I'm just illustrating how complex this is. For us to say, by using this data and possibly saving people in the future from hypothermia and such, they didn't die in vain. So Elie Wiesel writes quite clearly, it's not for us to arbitrate or decide what dying in vain is or is not. And I think that's a tremendously powerful thought to consider for a moment. That effectively saying, who are we sitting quite comfortably in 2021? Who are we to arbitrate what counts as dying in vain and a dishonor, and what counts as not dying in vain and an honor to their memory? That's one point to consider. But again, Avi, that's not discrediting your point at all. I don't think there's a clear black or white here whatsoever. Let's have a look at the first sort of halachic source here. And it's a lengthy one, but I'll summarize. It's a Talmud Gemara in Pesachim that says someone called Ravin, who lived probably in the 3rd century, I think. He came from Israel to a journey. He travels constant travel between Israel and Babylon. And he quoted Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, no, it would have been earlier in the 3rd century then, because Rabbi Yochanan was alive, I think. Rabbi Yochanan was the leading Amorah, the leading sage of that generation in the land of Israel. And his quote carries a lot of weight. He says, how do we know that you're allowed to heal? You can have medical benefit from any substance or any situation, except for those derived from idolatry, adultery, or murder. In other words, you can use any unethical source apart from that which came from the 3 cardinal sins in order to gain medical life-saving benefit. How do we know that? Asks the Gemara in reference to murder. It goes through each of the 3 cardinal sins, one after the other, and then the final question is, how do you know this applies with regards to murder? It's logical reasoning. The Gemara says you don't need a verse. It doesn't need to be chapter and verse. It's logic. Just think about it logically. There was an incident that demonstrates this. There was once a person who came before Rava. Rava was also a leading Amorah, a leading Talmudic sage. And this person said to him, a local official, probably a local official who was quite anti-Semitic, said to me, go off and kill so-and-so, and if you don't do it, I'll kill you. And he asked Rava, what should I do? Can I save my own life? Can I preserve my own life by killing this other person? Never met him in my life, no idea who he is, but this local official, this local authority has told me to do it, and if I don't do it, he says, I'm going to die. Rava said to him, I sympathize with your situation, but you cannot do it. It's preferable that he should kill you. Allow your own life to be taken rather than you murder someone else. What do you think? That your blood is redder than his? You're more precious than him? How do you know? You've no idea. Again, you can't arbitrate in terms of life and death. It's best left in God's hands and not in the hands of humanity. You cannot, says Rava, save your own life by taking someone else. So the Gemara says quite clearly that when it comes to deriving benefit from unethical sources, from medical advancements, totally fine, unless the source of that research was one of the 3 cardinal sins, and one of those is murder. Now, is that comparable to our discussion? At surface level, yes, but when you stop and think for a second, it obviously isn't. Why not? I know, Mark, I can see you shaking your head there.
Well, I mean, one always hesitates to challenge the Gemara, especially on the point of logic. But the truth is, those two, even the 2 circumstances in the Gemara, are not, in my humble opinion, not logically comparable. Because the halacha that you are not allowed to engage in, the 3, as it were, cardinal sins, and pikuach nefesh is set aside. I totally understand that. But in the circumstances here, the act in question has already happened. It's a past act. It's not a preventative act. I mean, just taking that concept one stage further. I mean, if we're talking about using data derived from the Nazi era, which is at least 70 years ago, right? I mean, that sort of tests the point, almost to destruction, doesn't it? Because there's no question about, as it were, making a moral decision between whose life is more valuable, the life of those victims of the Nazis or the prospective patients we're trying to heal. It's in the past. It's obviously, appalling beyond belief, but denying humanity the benefit of future healing, I just don't think it's sustainable based on the logic of this Gemara, which, as I say, I think is somewhat flawed anyway.
Mark, thank you very much. You'll probably be honored to learn you're in good company. Rashi himself seems to side with what Mark has said. Rashi unusually repeats the Gemara's example where the question of an ethical compromise is happening here and now, as in kill this person or you will die. It's happening in front of us in real time, present tense. Rashi repeats that and says, for example, if it's happening in front of you, which begs the question, as Marcus correctly said, what if it's already done? What if it's, forgive the flippancy of the term, what if it's done and dusted? It happened an eons ago. And what if, therefore, it's done? There isn't a direct link between my actions and the deaths of the innocent victims, which clearly in our question, there isn't. As painful as what's going on is, and it is painful, nothing I would do by taking precautions when I go skiing or fly over the North Sea, none of that directly contributed to their deaths. Is that okay? Now here we go into a very complex, and we'll see how much time we have to see the Adrian, are you waving hello at me?
Yeah. If I could just
yeah, sure.
Very briefly. Obviously, the Nazi experiments are a very stark example, and it's easier maybe to reach a moral judgment or ethical judgment around that. But there were lots of grey areas of examples. I mean, we know that war in general propels technological progress, right? So from a whole, as we develop weaponry and defence systems, so the whole, all our knowledge of drone science, I'm sure, has been massively accelerated by its use in drone strikes, some of which is questionable in terms of human rights, extrajudicial killings, and some innocent people who have been killed at weddings, all kinds of things that have happened through the use of drones. So, I mean, I suppose it goes back to Mark's point about to what extent, once one moves away from, say, the Nazi experiments to sort of greyer areas and pragmatism, how do you turn back, or how do you step aside from technological advancement that's come through human conflict and questionable human activity? And that's a rather big question, but kind of follows.
It is, and it's a fantastic question, Adrian. And I think that just to mention, now that you've mentioned it, just to build on that for a moment, the counter argument would be to essentially turn a blind eye permanently to whatever research and data exists and conduct the same experiments on more ethical terms at far greater expense and a far greater drain on time and resources. That would be the compromise. The second compromise, and I mentioned this just anecdotally, I presented this discussion about just over a year ago, actually, in Poland, funnily enough, in Krakow, in the old Jewish quarter of Krakow. We took a group of, when I say a group, it was more of a swarm of JFS students. There were 5 buses, 250 students. That's still not the whole year group, crazy as it sounds. I think it was the biggest single trip from a Jewish school in Europe, which was fantastic. And I gave this discussion in front of about 80 of these, so a small selection of the 250 participants. And a very moving and powerful moment was one girl stuck her hand up and she said, I want to challenge the very notion that these experiments can be used, as we've said, to save lives. And I said, what do you mean? Like hypothermia is deadly, it's fatal, of course it's life-saving. And she said, well, yes and no. She said, every year I go with my, she said, I grew up quite privileged, and every year I go skiing with my family. And she says, it's the highlight of my family's year. We love it, it's exhilarating, it's fun. And then she says, I would gladly sacrifice my skiing holiday, and I would gladly never go on an airplane again if it meant I knew without a doubt that people wouldn't suffer in order to make me safe. Or as she put it, in order to make sure my ski equipment is warm enough. I found that from a 16-year-old girl to be thinking that broadly and that deeply, I found very moving and very powerful. And it challenged the very core of, is this even research that contributes to saving lives? As an aside, and maybe if we have time, I know we don't have much time, we'll get back to it, a scandal that broke 2 days ago about the vaccination process in Israel, for example. You can see a clear difference between someone who chooses voluntarily to go skiing or to go mountaineering in the winter or to fly over the North Sea in the winter, whatever that is. They've done that voluntarily. Compared to the current pandemic, there was a scandal that broke 2 days ago that apparently the various vaccination companies have been harvesting data from Israeli vaccinees, if that's the right way to put it, without their consent, without their knowledge, in order to conduct desperately and urgently needed findings about gaps between vaccines, effects of vaccines. And it turns out that millions of Israelis have been vaccinated and their personal medical data has been passed on to the likes of AstraZeneca and Pfizer and the group in Oxford without their knowledge or consent, which again, it's a minor ethical breach, a GDPR breach, but it's still unethical. But that seems to be much closer to saying this will prevent death. This is a matter of life and death. Let's have a look at a piece of Rambam, Maimonides, and then we'll wrap up I think we'll leave it with a bit of a question, which perhaps is a good way to leave off. There is a halacha, there's a mitzvah, say a positive commandment, as we know in Judaism, places great importance and value on burying the dead as soon as possible, ideally on the day of death itself. The Rambam says as follows: all those executed by the Beth Din in the times when the death penalty still applied and capital punishment still existed, it doesn't since the destruction of the temple, but then there was a positive commandment to bury the executed before sunset, as it says, you shall surely bury on that day, for a hanged body, a hung body, I don't know how, I think it's hanged is the past participle, is an affront to God. Do not defile the land that God has given you to possess. Rambam adds, and he adds this based on the Beraita, a Mishnaic teaching in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's not clear if what he adds now is biblical or rabbinic in origin. There are many who hold it's rabbinic and many who hold it's biblical, but he adds, furthermore, we do not hang the accused on a gallows attached to the ground, i.e. a tree, so as not to incur unnecessary delays in chopping it down. Why would that incur an unnecessary delay? He continues, this is because the beam on which he is hanged must be buried with him, so that it does not become a remembrance to the wicked that people will say, they'll walk past it and say, this was the beam on which so-and-so who committed such and such a crime was hanged. Now, when Rambam adds that to the end, that we therefore bury the executed with all of the tools, as it were, the tools of execution, including the wood, the beam itself, his addition, so that it does not become a monument or a remembrance, the memory of the wicked, it's intriguing, especially as the Torah we've just read, the real reason behind this, it's an affront to God. It's not a good thing to leave a body lying around overnight. What does this mean? And the question is, I'd love to hear your opinions, and then we'll wrap up. You shall surely bury on that day, for a hanged body is an affront to God. What is the affront? What's so bad? What's wrong? And remember, we're talking about a criminal here, not an innocent victim in the times of the Holocaust, a criminal who is guilty of part of a capital offense. He's been executed, and the Torah says, nonetheless, bury him. For a hanged body, leaving him lying around is an affront to God. What does that mean? Is there more than one way to interpret that?
I'm wondering if this means perhaps that that there's a shame to the community that somebody got to the state where they had to be hanged.
It could be it's an embarrassment. Correct. It could be like it's a testament.
A Sanhedrin that had to execute more than one person, however many decades, was considered bloodthirsty.
Correct, I'll be one person in 70 years, as we're told. And it's to leave this person publicly displayed is a very poor reflection on the decay of society. That could be one way, and it's an affront. In any other ways, this could be an affront?
Well, I mean, there's the wider point, isn't it, about Selem Elokim. This is each body in some way, in a way we don't necessarily understand, resembles the divine, and it's kind of a desecration that it's ended up in this way. Then there's another point, which is that if you leave it there as a monument, you're getting benefit from it. You're getting benefit in the sense of it being a warning to everybody else. So you're taking benefit from the execution of a human being by using it as a public kind of warning, or public information broadcast.
Adrian, thank you very, very much. Avi and Adrian, you're both in esteemed company. This question breaks into two. I've only noted the Rishonim here, the medieval scholars who are powerhouses in terms of commentaries, and you can see the groupings here. Adrian, you're in the company of Rashi, Ovadia, Safona, Ramban, and Ralbag, and many others who say that the affront to God by leaving the body hanging there is a degradation, for man was made in his image, but Tselem Elokim, as Adrian has said, and it's therefore dishonorable to leave, even though he was a criminal, and even though he committed the most horrendous crime, it's a dishonor to the fact that he was at one point created in God's image, to leave him lying there overnight. A second group, which I think is closer, Avi, to what you said, Ibn Ezra Darts the Kainim, which is the Tosfot, the Chizkuni, Rabbeinu Asher, who is the Rosh, Rashbam, Ralbag is in both groups. He quotes both reasonings here. And they are of the opinion, this second school of thought, that leaving the body hanging is in a manner a curse to God, because this evildoer blasphemed God. The crimes they committed were so unthinkable that it's therefore ill-advised to leave the body overnight. Their concern is more of a societal, less metaphysical, less talking about being created in the image of God. Their concern is more societal or communal. They're worried if we leave the artifacts, the beam, the noose, whatever was used to execute this person, if we leave them lying around, even for a brief period of time, there is a concern. People will walk past and say, oh, that was the beam that what's his name was hanged on, and oh, because he did this, and desensitize themselves to the crime. There's an added complication here that's a worry, and this is developed, if I remember correctly, in the Rashbam. The Rashbam talks about the human psyche. And he says, again, from a societal perspective, if you leave these artifacts in public, what will happen is, and this was a huge concern, we know when, for example, Osama bin Laden, when he was killed and brought to justice, they, as far as I remember, they actually threw his body in the sea. Why? Because they didn't want his burial place to become some sort of a shrine to extremists. And there's a problem, says the Rashbam, if you leave any of these artifacts lying around, other evildoers will gather to them and treat them almost as a shrine to evil, and learn and take example from the horrific behavior exhibited by this criminal. Now, the second school of thought, which as you can see, there's so many medieval heavy hitters gathered here around the second school of thought. There is a sensitivity, and it's urgent, to perpetuating the legacy of the wicked. Now, this might mean celebrating their accomplishments. It might mean giving them credibility. It might even mean encouraging others to emulate what they did. There is a matter of grave concern. And it's pretty clear now, the link between, and now you know why we've gone on a bit of a magical mystery tour, but there's a clear link between the laws of the Beth Din and its executions and our discussion. And that link is, put very simply, is there a concern that by utilizing the data and the research that the Nazis did, are we in some way celebrating their legacy? Are we perpetuating their legacy? Is it simply better, as Dr. Robert Berger argued very strongly, to close the book, close the chapter, leave it behind permanently, and move on as a collective humanity? That is a real concern. And that's when you look at it from a societal perspective. And indeed, in the wake of the Second World War, and we'll finish with these last two slides, Rav Meshulam Roth in the Kol Mevaser, his responsa, he wrote this in 1951. This is before the Six-Day War. And there was a tradition that there was something called the Chamber of the Holocaust on Mount Zion, which is sort of behind the old city of, overlooking the old city of Jerusalem. And they had a ceremony there every year on a fast day. And the ceremony was, they would recite Tehillim, as you guys did before this session. They would say certain prayers and certain memorial speeches for the victims of the Holocaust. And after a few years of this, someone wrote to Rabbi Roth and said they were quite disturbed by the fact that the Chazan, the person who led the ceremony on Mount Zion, used a noose that was used in one of the concentration camps as a gartel. Sort of, he would put on a talit in the Hasidic custom, and then use the noose that was used to execute Jewish victims as a belt, as it were. And then he would step up as the Chazan and perform the ceremony and make the speeches, recite the Tehillim and the prayers, etc. And this person was bothered by it. And they wrote to Rabbi Roth, who was a leading Torah authority in Israel at the time. He lived and died in Haifa, in the north of Israel. And Rabbi Roth says, In my opinion, you cannot use these artifacts in this way. They should be buried immediately. Seemingly deriving this, and really again, this is two-pronged. On the one hand, you're perpetuating the legacy of evildoers, and on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, the argument that Elie Wiesel puts forward so strongly is it may be an affront and an offense to the victims. And we can't arbitrate if it is or isn't, which goes back, I think it was Mark or Avi made the point earlier. We can't sort of decide what is considered dying in vain and what is not, what is an honor to their memory and what is not. Adrian, I'll just get to you in just a second. Just going to finish this last one, and Adrian, I'll come back to you and take any more questions. The difference, though, is this ceremony was just a ceremony. It was nice. It was obviously very moving, but it was only a ceremony. The Chassam Sofer, or Moshe Sofer, who died in Pressburg, which was in Hungary, Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, he writes, and this brings us back to our girl from JFS's point, if you can demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that there is an urgent, pressing, current need to save lives, post facto, after the fact, you are allowed to derive benefit from any data and research. Because again, when the Gemara says don't derive benefit from the 3 cardinal sins, as we've pointed out, I think Mark, you pointed this out, that's different because that's happening here and now in front of us. What if it's already happened a generation ago? Can you use it? The Chassam Sofer says, yes, you can, if you can demonstrate it's required to save lives. And at which point I'll conclude by bringing back in the JFS student who made the very powerful point, is it really saving lives? Or can we just make more sacrifices in our personal choices to avoid putting ourselves in life-risking situations through hypothermia? So that, I hope, is quite a bit of food for thought. There is a bit more to discuss, but we'll leave it there. And thank you very much for having me. Adrian, you had a question, and anyone else with questions or other points to add, please feel free.
I'm just conscious of time, actually. So I was just going to say, if you use the example of the beam, of course, and your reference to JFS, we do take, I mean, I've been, and I'm sure many people have, we've been to the camps, and so in a way we are seeing those, you know, we are seeing the instruments of torture and death, you know, the gas chambers. So, you know, that suggests that we have prioritized remembrance and memory, and we do treat these sites in some way as sanctified with the death of our martyrs, and so there's a bit of ambiguity there, I would say.
It is a fantastic point, and Adrian, it brings me back to the point of histaklut, of looking. Is looking at something considered deriving benefit? It would seem that even according to the Shulchan Aruch and those who side with him, that it is considered a benefit. That is only when you actually enjoy what you're looking at. So in a situation where what you're looking at brings you sorrow and heartbreak, it's not considered benefit. And at such point, you would say the educational value of having those things on display outweighs the unethical value of perhaps insulting the memories or perpetuating the evil legacy of the perpetrators. But it is a really good question. And thank you again. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you very much for inviting me. I wish you all a very pleasant day. Any other questions before we log off?
Could I bring one actually that seems relevant here? There's our Rabbi, who is a Holocaust educator himself, who has led many trips over more than 10 years. On Tisha B'Av, he uses bricks that he has taken from the crematoria, from the gas chambers even, of Auschwitz, upon which he lights candles. And this seems very similar to, you know, the using the noose, etc. But you've just answered the fact that, you know, this is not something that we enjoy looking at. Does this have enough educational value, in your opinion, to outweigh the affront to any memory?
Oh, hi.
It is It is a really good point, Avi, and I think also to bear in mind that there is a differentiation between items that were used directly to murder and, as you've said, bricks from the crematoria or the gas chambers, which the bricks themselves were not the means of murder, whereas the noose was. There is a differentiation between the two. A really good point. I did see in the chat, I think Yaakov mentioned about, I've got to confess, I only read this article yesterday, quite late at night. So someone had said to me, there's a scandal going on in Israel with data from the vaccinations. So I really don't know exactly what's going on the ground. I would hope, I'm sure it is anonymously forwarded, but perhaps there is still something unethical about not telling a person that I don't know. As I said, just a rabbi, not a doctor. Thank you very much for having me, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
That was very stimulating, thought-provoking, and just also to thank Rabbi Karlbach as well for leading us with the Tehillim and generally for all the support that he continues to give us as well. So thank you, and I hope we can have you back at some point as well. Thank you, Rabbi Birnbaum.
With pleasure. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Thank you everyone
all the best.
for joining. We wish you all a good week.
Thanks, Adrian.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.